Welcome back, story lovers, to a One Storyteller the channel, where every tale is a journey, every character comes to life, and every twist will leave you breathless. Whether you're here for the drama, the suspense, or the life lessons, we've got you covered. Today's story is one that will shake you to your core. It's a tale of injustice, courage, and the kind of karma that will make you believe in the power of destiny. So grab your popcorn, settle in, and let's dive into this unforgettable story. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Let's begin. Willow Creek was a quiet, unassuming town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. But beneath its peaceful surface, Willow Creek had a dark underbelly, one that few dared to acknowledge. Officer Brad Grayson was one of the most feared men in town. A veteran cop with a reputation for being harsh and unyielding, Brad had a particular disdain for anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable. His racism was an open secret, whispered about but never confronted. The townsfolk were too afraid of his power and influence to speak out. On the other side of town lived Naomi Carter, a strong-willed and compassionate woman who had recently been appointed as the town's first black police chief. Naomi was a beacon of hope for many, a symbol of progress in a town that had long been resistant to change. But her appointment had ruffled more than a few feathers, especially Brad's. It was a crisp autumn evening when the tension between Naomi and Brad finally boiled over. Naomi had been working late reviewing case files in her office when Brad stormed in, his face red with anger. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over?" he spat, slamming his fist on her desk. "This town doesn't need someone like you calling the shots." Naomi remained calm, her eyes steady. "Brad, this isn't about me. It's about doing what's right for Willow Creek. If you have a problem with that, maybe it's time you reconsidered your place here." Brad's jaw tightened. "You'll regret this," he growled before storming out. Later that night, Naomi was walking home when she heard footsteps behind her. Before she could react, a bag was thrown over her head and she was dragged into the shadows. When the bag was removed, she found herself tied to the train tracks on the outskirts of town. Brad stood over her, a cruel smile on his face. "You thought you could change things?" he sneered. "This town doesn't belong to people like you. Let's see how brave you are when the 8:15 train comes through." Naomi struggled against the ropes, but they were too tight. She could hear the distant rumble of the train approaching. Her heart pounded as she realized the gravity of her situation. As the train drew closer, Naomi's mind raced. She thought of her family, her friends, and the community she had sworn to protect. She refused to let Brad's hatred be the last thing she remembered. Summoning all her strength, she began to scream for help. Meanwhile, in town, a group of teenagers had been hanging out near the tracks. They heard Naomi's cries and rushed to investigate. What they found left them horrified. "We have to do something," one of them shouted, pulling out a pocket knife to cut the ropes, but the train was now just minutes away. The police station was in chaos. Officer Linda Harper had just brought in a suspect, handcuffed and defiant, but the atmosphere shifted the moment the bag was removed from the suspect's head. The room fell silent as everyone realized who it was. Chief Marcus Thompson. Linda had been smug, confident in her actions. She had dragged the suspect into the station, ignoring the protests and the growing unease among her colleagues. "Book him," she had ordered, her voice dripping with disdain. "Resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. Make sure he knows who's in charge here." But as the bag was removed, revealing Marcus's face, the room froze. Marcus, though handcuffed, stood tall, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Officer Harper," he said, his voice calm but firm, "do you realize what you've done?" Linda's confidence wavered for the first time. She blinked, her mind racing to process the situation. "Chief Thompson?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had just arrested her own boss, the man who had the power to end her career with a single word. Her face turned pale and she took a step back as if trying to distance herself from the gravity of her mistake. Officer Jake Reynolds, who had been watching the entire exchange, stepped forward. "Linda, do you realize who you just arrested?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and anger. Linda's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked around the room searching for support but found none. Her colleagues were staring at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and disapproval. Marcus, though furious, remained composed. "Uncuff me," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Linda hesitated, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. Finally, she unlocked the handcuffs, her movements slow and unsteady. Marcus rubbed his wrists, his eyes never leaving Linda's face. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice cold and authoritative. "You have abused your power, disrespected your colleagues, and undermined the integrity of this department. You will be held accountable for your actions." The station erupted into a flurry of activity. Officers rushed to assist Marcus, while others began documenting the incident. Linda stood frozen, her mind racing as she tried to comprehend the consequences of her actions. Jake approached her, his expression a mix of anger and pity. "What were you thinking, Linda?" he asked. "How could you do something like this?" Linda shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't realize." "That's no excuse," Jake interrupted. "You've crossed a line, and there's no coming back from this." News of the incident spread quickly, thanks to Jake's discreet recording. The video showing Linda's aggressive behavior and her shocking realization went viral within hours. The public's reaction was immediate and intense. Protesters gathered outside the police station, demanding justice for Marcus and accountability for Linda. Social media was flooded with posts condemning Linda's actions and calling for systemic change. Marcus, though the victim, knew he had to address the situation. He called a press conference, where he stood tall and composed, despite the turmoil he must have been feeling. "This incident is a stark reminder of the issues we face within our department," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We cannot serve the community if we do not hold ourselves accountable. This is about more than one officer. It's about the kind of department we want to be." Linda, meanwhile, was in a state of shock. She had always believed that she was untouchable, but now her world was crumbling around her. She was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, and her colleagues avoided her like the plague. One evening, Linda found herself sitting in a small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town. She was scrolling through news articles about the incident when a familiar face walked in, Jake Reynolds. The fallout from Officer Linda Harper's misconduct was swift and far-reaching. The video of her arresting Chief Marcus Thompson had gone viral, sparking outrage across the city and beyond. The Crestwood Police Department was under intense scrutiny, and the City Council knew they had to act quickly to restore public trust. The City Council convened an emergency meeting to address the situation. Council Chairman Robert Hayes opened the session with a somber tone. "What we've seen is unacceptable," he said. "The actions of Officer Linda Harper have not only damaged the reputation of our police department, but have also shaken the trust of our community. We must take immediate action to investigate this matter thoroughly and ensure that justice is served." The council unanimously voted to launch a formal investigation into Linda's conduct. They appointed an independent review board composed of legal experts, community leaders, and retired law enforcement officers to oversee the process. The review board wasted no time in getting to work. They began by interviewing key witnesses, including Marcus Thompson, Tasha Johnson, and Officer Jake Reynolds. They also reviewed the video footage of the incident, which had become the centerpiece of the case. Jake was one of the first to testify. He recounted the events of that night in detail, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I saw Officer Harper arrest Chief Thompson without cause," he said. "She was aggressive, disrespectful, and completely out of line. I knew I had to do something, so I recorded the incident." The board members listened intently, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. "Thank you for your bravery, Officer Reynolds," one of them said. "Your actions have brought this matter to light, and we will ensure that justice is served." Next, Tasha Johnson took the stand. She spoke about her own experience with Linda, describing how the officer had treated her with disdain and hostility. "I was 7 months pregnant, and she didn't care," Tasha said, her voice breaking. "She treated me like I was nothing. That's not what a police officer should be." The board members were visibly moved by Tasha's testimony. "Thank you for sharing your story," one of them said. "Your courage is inspiring, and we will do everything in our power to ensure that no one else has to go through what you did." Finally, Marcus Thompson addressed the board. "Officer Harper's actions are a reflection of a deeper problem within our department," he said. "We cannot serve the community if we don't hold ourselves accountable. This is about more than one officer. It's about the kind of department we want to be." Marcus's words resonated deeply with the board members. "Thank you, Chief Thompson," one of them said. "Your leadership is crucial in this difficult time, and we will work with you to ensure that the necessary changes are made." As the investigation progressed, the board uncovered a pattern of misconduct by Linda Harper. They reviewed her personnel file, which revealed a history of complaints from citizens and fellow officers. Many of these complaints had been dismissed or ignored, allowing Linda to continue her abusive behavior unchecked. The board also interviewed several of Linda's former colleagues, who spoke about her arrogance and disdain for anyone she deemed beneath her. "She always acted like she was above the law," one officer said. "It was only a matter of time before something like this happened." The evidence against Linda was overwhelming. In addition to the video footage and witness testimonies, the board discovered text messages and emails in which Linda made racist and derogatory remarks. These messages painted a clear picture of a woman who had no respect for the people she was sworn to protect. The board also found that Linda had a history of disproportionately targeting black citizens in her policing. Statistics showed that over 80% of her arrests and traffic stops involved people of color, a clear indication of racial profiling. As the investigation unfolded, the public's outrage grew. Protesters gathered outside the police station demanding justice for Marcus and Tasha. Social media was flooded with posts condemning Linda's actions and calling for systemic change. Marcus, Tasha, and Jake became symbols of the fight against police misconduct. They were invited to speak at rallies and community events where they shared their stories and called for accountability. Linda, meanwhile, was in a state of shock. She had always believed that she was untouchable, but now her world was crumbling around her. She was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, and her colleagues avoided her like the plague. One evening, Linda found herself sitting in a small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town. She was scrolling through news articles about the investigation when a familiar face walked in, Jake Reynolds. Jake hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Linda nodded, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" Jake hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Linda nodded, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" Jake took a seat across from her. "I just wanted to talk. See how you're doing?" Linda scoffed. "How do you think I'm doing? My life is ruined." Jake leaned forward, his tone earnest. "It doesn't have to be. You made mistakes, Linda, but that doesn't mean you can't learn from them. You could use your experience to help others, to make things right." Linda looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and regret. "And who would listen to me? I'm the villain in this story." "You don't have to be," Jake said softly. "It's never too late to change." Linda didn't respond, but Jake's words lingered in her mind long after he left. The fallout from Linda's actions marked a turning point for Crestwood. The city was forced to confront the deep-seated issues within its police department, and the demand for reform was louder than ever. As the investigation continued, the city council scheduled a public hearing to announce their verdict. The entire city was on edge, waiting to see what would happen next. The video of Officer Linda Harper arresting Chief Marcus Thompson had gone viral, and the backlash was swift and severe. The entire city of Crestwood was in an uproar, with citizens demanding justice for Marcus and accountability for Linda. The police department, once a symbol of authority, was now under intense scrutiny. The video, recorded by Officer Jake Reynolds, had been uploaded to social media within hours of the incident. It spread like wildfire, with thousands of people sharing it and expressing their outrage. Hashtags like Justice for Marcus and Fire Linda Harper began trending on Twitter, and news outlets picked up the story. The video showed Linda's aggressive behavior, her blatant disrespect for Marcus, and her refusal to acknowledge her mistake. It was a damning piece of evidence that left no room for doubt about her misconduct. The public's reaction was immediate and intense. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read "Justice for Marcus" and "Fire the racist cop." Chants of "No justice, no peace" echoed through the streets as people demanded accountability. Marcus, who had been released as soon as the truth came to light, gave an interview to a local news station. "This is not just about me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about the systemic racism that has plagued our city for far too long. It's time for change." Tasha Johnson, the pregnant woman who had been wrongfully arrested by Linda, also spoke out. "I was treated like I was nothing," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "But I'm not nothing. I'm a human being, and I deserve to be treated with respect." The Crestwood Police Department was in chaos. Officers were divided, with some supporting Linda and others calling for her dismissal. Chief Marcus Thompson, despite being the victim, knew he had to take control of the situation. He called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. "This is a critical moment for our department," he said, his voice firm. "We cannot let this incident define us. We must take immediate action to address the issues that led to this and ensure that justice is served." Marcus outlined a plan to launch an internal investigation into Linda's conduct and to review the department's policies and procedures. He also announced that he would be working with the city council to implement reforms aimed at preventing future incidents. Linda, meanwhile, was in a state of shock. She had always believed that she was untouchable, but now her world was crumbling around her. She was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, and her colleagues avoided her like the plague. One evening, Linda found herself sitting in a small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town. She was scrolling through news articles about the incident when a familiar face walked in, Jake Reynolds. Jake hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Linda nodded, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" Jake took a seat across from her. "I just wanted to talk, see how you're doing." Linda scoffed. "How do you think I'm doing? My life is ruined." Jake leaned forward, his tone earnest. "It doesn't have to be. You made mistakes, Linda, but that doesn't mean you can't learn from them. You could use your experience to help others, to make things right." Linda looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and regret. "And who would listen to me? I'm the villain in this story." "You don't have to be," Jake said softly. "It's never too late to change." Linda didn't respond, but Jake's words lingered in her mind long after he left. The city council launched an immediate investigation into Linda's conduct. They appointed an independent review board composed of legal experts, community leaders, and retired law enforcement officers to oversee the process. The board began by interviewing key witnesses, including Marcus, Tasha, and Jake. They also reviewed the video footage and Linda's personnel file, which revealed a history of complaints and disciplinary actions. As the investigation progressed, the board uncovered a pattern of misconduct by Linda. They found that she had a history of disproportionately targeting black citizens in her policing, and that many of her actions had been overlooked or ignored by her superiors. The public's outrage continued to grow as more details about Linda's misconduct came to light. Protesters gathered outside the city council chambers, demanding that she be held accountable for her actions. Marcus, Tasha, and Jake became symbols of the fight against police misconduct. They were invited to speak at rallies and community events, where they shared their stories and called for accountability. "This is not just about one officer," Marcus said at a rally. "This is about the systemic issues that have allowed this kind of behavior to persist. We must come together as a community to demand change." Tasha added, "I'm here today because people stood up for what was right. We all have a responsibility to do the same." The fallout from Linda's actions marked a turning point for Crestwood. The city was forced to confront the deep-seated issues within its police department, and the demand for reform was louder than ever. As the investigation continued, the city council scheduled a public hearing to announce their verdict. The entire city was on edge, waiting to see what would happen next. Jake took a seat across from her. "I just wanted to talk, see how you're doing." Linda looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and regret. "And who would listen to me? I'm the villain in this story." "You don't have to be," Jake said softly. "It's never too late to change." Linda didn't respond, but Jake's words lingered in her mind long after he left. After weeks of investigation, the review board reached a decision. They compiled their findings into a detailed report which they presented to the city council. The report outlined Linda's misconduct, the systemic issues within the police department, and recommendations for reform. The council scheduled a public hearing to announce their verdict. The entire city was on edge, waiting to see what would happen next. The day of the disciplinary hearing had arrived, and the atmosphere in the city council chambers was electric. News of Officer Linda Harper's misconduct had spread like wildfire, and the entire city was watching to see how the situation would be resolved. The room was packed with reporters, community members, and police officers, all eager to witness the outcome. The council chairman, a stern-faced man named Robert Hayes, called the hearing to order. "This is a formal disciplinary hearing to address the actions of Officer Linda Harper," he announced. "We are here to determine whether her conduct violated departmental policies and to decide on an appropriate course of action." Linda sat at the defendant's table, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. She had always been confident, even arrogant, but today she looked small and vulnerable. Her attorney, a slick middle-aged man named Greg, sat beside her, whispering last-minute advice. On the other side of the room sat Marcus Thompson, Tasha Johnson, and Officer Jake Reynolds. Marcus's presence was a powerful reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just about one officer's misconduct. It was about the integrity of the entire police department. The hearing began with testimonies from key witnesses. Jake was the first to take the stand. He recounted the events of that fateful night, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I saw Officer Harper arrest Chief Thompson without cause," he said. "She was aggressive, disrespectful, and completely out of line. I knew I had to do something, so I recorded the incident." The video was played for the council, and the room fell silent as the footage unfolded. Linda's face flushed with shame as she watched herself on the screen, her arrogance and cruelty laid bare for all to see. Next, Tasha took the stand. She spoke about her own experience with Linda, describing how the officer had treated her with disdain and hostility. "I was 7 months pregnant, and she didn't care," Tasha said, her voice breaking. "She treated me like I was nothing. That's not what a police officer should be." Finally, Marcus addressed the council. "Officer Harper's actions are a reflection of a deeper problem within our department," he said. "We cannot serve the community if we don't hold ourselves accountable. This is about more than one officer, it's about the kind of department we want to be." When it was Linda's turn to speak, she stood hesitantly, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. I made a mistake," she began, her voice trembling. "I let my emotions get the best of me and I acted unprofessionally. But I've been a dedicated officer for over a decade. I've put my life on the line for this city. I'm asking for a second chance." Her attorney, Greg, argued passionately on her behalf. "Officer Harper has a long record of service," he said. "One mistake shouldn't erase everything she's done. She's willing to undergo counseling and sensitivity training. We ask that you consider her years of dedication when making your decision." The council members retreated to a private room to deliberate. The tension in the chambers was palpable as everyone waited for the verdict. Marcus, Tasha, and Jake sat together, their expressions a mix of hope and anxiety. "Do you think they'll do the right thing?" Tasha asked quietly. Marcus nodded. "They have to. The whole city is watching." Jake clenched his fists. "If they let her off the hook, it'll send the wrong message. People will lose faith in the system." After what felt like an eternity, the council members returned to the room. Robert Hayes stood at the podium, his expression grave. "After careful consideration," he began, "we have reached a decision." "Officer Linda Harper," Hayes continued, "your actions in the case of Chief Marcus Thompson and Tasha Johnson were not only unethical but also a blatant abuse of power. Your behavior is a disgrace to the police force and undermines the trust we strive to build with the community. Therefore, it is the decision of this council that you be dismissed from the Crestwood Police Department, effective immediately." The room erupted in applause. Tasha let out a sob of relief, while Marcus and Jake exchanged a look of quiet satisfaction. Linda sat frozen, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. As the hearing adjourned, Linda was escorted out of the room by two officers. She avoided eye contact with everyone, her head bowed in shame. Outside the chambers, reporters swarmed, shouting questions and snapping photos. Marcus, Tasha, and Jake held a brief press conference. "This is a victory for justice," Marcus said, his voice strong and clear. "But it's also a reminder that we have a lot of work to do. We must continue to fight for accountability and equality in our department and our community." Tasha added, "This isn't just about me or Chief Thompson. It's about everyone who has ever been treated unfairly. Today we took a step in the right direction." The verdict marked a turning point for Crestwood. The dismissal of Linda Harper sent a clear message that misconduct would not be tolerated. It also sparked a wave of reforms within the police department, as Marcus and his team worked to rebuild trust with the community. For Linda, the verdict was a harsh wake-up call. Stripped of her badge and her identity as an officer, she was forced to confront the consequences of her actions. It was a humbling experience, one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The dismissal of Officer Linda Harper sent shockwaves through the Crestwood Police Department. For years, her behavior had been tolerated, even excused by those who turned a blind eye to her racism and abuse of power. But now, with her gone, the department was forced to confront the systemic issues that had allowed someone like her to thrive. Marcus Thompson, now fully reinstated as chief of police, wasted no time in implementing sweeping reforms. His first order of business was to address the toxic culture that had festered within the department for far too long. He called an emergency meeting with all officers, detectives, and administrative staff. The room was tense as Marcus stood at the podium, his presence commanding respect. "What happened with Officer Harper was not an isolated incident," he began, his voice steady but firm. "It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a problem we can no longer afford to ignore." He outlined a series of changes, including mandatory sensitivity training, implicit bias workshops, and a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling. He also announced the creation of an independent oversight committee to review complaints against officers and ensure accountability. "This is not about punishing anyone," Marcus continued. "It's about rebuilding trust, trust within this department, and trust with the community we serve. We cannot do our jobs effectively if the people we're sworn to protect don't believe in us." The room was silent as his words sank in. For some, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was a long overdue reckoning. Officer Jake Reynolds, the young cop who had recorded Linda's misconduct, found himself thrust into the spotlight. His bravery in exposing the truth had not gone unnoticed, and Marcus appointed him to lead the department's new community outreach program. Jake was hesitant at first. "I'm just a rookie," he admitted during a private meeting with Marcus. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like this." Marcus smiled. "You stood up for what was right when it mattered most. That's the kind of leadership we need. "You're not just a rookie, Jake. You're a role model." With Marcus's encouragement, Jake threw himself into the role. He organized town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns and suggestions. He also worked with local schools to create programs that fostered positive relationships between young people and law enforcement. Tasha Johnson, the pregnant woman who had been wrongfully arrested by Linda, became a vocal advocate for police reform. Her story had touched the hearts of many, and she used her platform to push for change. She partnered with Marcus and Jake to launch the Justice for All initiative, a campaign aimed at addressing racial bias and promoting transparency in law enforcement. Tasha also shared her story at rallies and conferences, inspiring others to speak out against injustice. "What happened to me could have ended very differently," she said during a speech at a community event. "But I'm here today because people stood up for what was right. We all have a responsibility to do the same." As for Linda Harper, her life took a dramatic turn after her dismissal. Stripped of her badge and pension, she struggled to find work. Her reputation was in tatters, and she was shunned by former colleagues and friends. One day, Linda found herself sitting in a small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town. She was scrolling through news articles about the reforms Marcus had implemented when a familiar face walked in. Jake Reynolds. Jake hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Linda nodded, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" Jake took a seat across from her. "I just wanted to talk, see how you're doing." Linda scoffed. "How do you think I'm doing? My life is ruined." Jake leaned forward, his tone earnest. "It doesn't have to be. You made mistakes, Linda, but that doesn't mean you can't learn from them. You could use your experience to help others, to make things right." Linda looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and regret. "And who would listen to me? I'm the villain in this story." "You don't have to be," Jake said softly. "It's never too late to change." Linda didn't respond, but Jake's words lingered in her mind long after he left. Months passed, and the changes in Crestwood began to take root. The police department, once a source of fear and mistrust, was slowly becoming a symbol of hope and progress. Marcus's leadership had inspired a new generation of officers who were committed to serving their community with integrity and compassion. One evening, Marcus stood on the steps of the police station, watching as the sun set over the city. Tasha and Jake joined him, their faces glowing with pride. "We've come a long way," Tasha said, her hand resting on her now rounded belly. "But there's still so much work to do." Marcus nodded. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but as long as we keep moving forward, we'll get there." Jake smiled. "And we'll do it together." As the three of them stood there, united by their shared vision for a better future, they knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But they also knew that they were not alone. The people of Crestwood had shown that when they stood together, they were unstoppable. And that, my friends, is the power of karma. A story of darkness turned to light, of hatred overcome by courage. If this tale moved you, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, every like, comment, and subscription helps us bring more stories like this to life. Until next time, this is A1 Storyteller signing off. Stay curious, stay kind, and always believe in the power of a good story. See you soon.